You can be pro-Israel and be very sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. I am. I am, and I don't trust people who can't at least feel some sympathy for the very difficult situation many Palestinians face. Here's the question, though, and Elie Wiesel, I think, put it very well when he spoke on this topic, because he is a very compassionate man who does feel a great sympathy for Palestinian suffering. He said the Palestinians have a right to be angry. They have a right to be angry. But they shouldn't be angry at Israel. They should be angry at their parents. And I would add they should be angry at their grandparents. Because it turns out that Israel has offered the Palestinians an independent Palestinian state on 5 separate occasions. And on 5 separate occasions, they've turned down the offer. And most of the time that the Palestinians have turned down the offer of a Palestinian state, the result has been one of great tragedy for the Jews and quite often for the Palestinians themselves. Golda Meir, Israel's prime minister in the 70s, put it quite well when she said, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And there's a lot of truth to that. Offer number 1 goes back to 1937, before there even was a state of Israel. Britain has a mandate over the land that is called Palestine. And Britain faces a problem that we continue to face to this very day. You have 2 separate people claiming this little strip of land as their homeland. Jews and Arabs. How do you resolve this conflict? And in an effort to be Solomonic, the British appointed a commission called the Peel Commission, who investigated this problem and came up with a solution. 2 people claiming the same land, split the land. That's the answer. Divide it between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. There we go. This was the Peel Commission recommendation in 1937. What they offered the Jews was a tiny strip of land far smaller than the present-day state of Israel. You see that purple? That's what they offered the Jews. Less than 1/3 of the entire land there. It was basically a tiny coastal strip there where the city of Tel Aviv is and the Galilee. Everything in green was going to go to the Arabs as an Arab state, and a little corridor in between with Jerusalem was going to be international. This was the Peel Commission recommendation. This is 1937. Storm clouds are gathering in Europe. Jews are desperate for a piece of land anywhere on earth they can call their own and have their independence in. The Jewish community was largely inclined to accept this plan, even though the Jewish state on offer was tiny. Just to put this in perspective, all of that land you see in color, green and purple, it's the size of the state of New Jersey. So what was on offer to the Jews was less than 1/3 the state of New Jersey as the Jewish state. The Jews said yes. The Arabs said no. No, we will not recognize a Jewish state anywhere in this land. We will not allow a Jewish state anywhere in the Middle East. We don't recognize the claims of the other side. This is our land, not theirs. We refuse to recognize a second valid claim. They turned it down. What happened next is a part of history and an appeasement that's often forgotten. We often talk about Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler in Munich. And Hitler said, if you give me the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, there'll be peace in our time. And Chamberlain believed him, gave him a piece of Czechoslovakia. That's the appeasement we always hear in 1938. There was also a huge British appeasement in 1939. After the Arabs rejected the Peel Commission partition plan, they began rioting because they didn't want more Jews coming to live anywhere in the land of Israel. They began rioting, they began attacking British installations, they began attacking Jewish communities. Britain's response to this Arab revolt, this Arab uprising, was to appease them. They said, okay, we got it. You don't want a Jewish state, there won't be a Jewish state. You don't like Jews coming to live in their ancestral homeland, that's okay too. We'll cut Jewish immigration off. They issued the 1939 White Paper. They basically, with a couple of small exceptions, ended Jewish immigration to Palestine, ended the Jewish return to their homeland. What was going on in 1939 in Europe? Adolf Hitler is trying to find a final solution to the Jewish problem. As of 1939, when this white paper was issued, he did not yet want to kill Europe's Jews. He was still hoping to expel them. His first plan was to get the Jews out of Europe and send them somewhere else. He had a committee seriously looking at the island of Madagascar off the coast of Africa as a possible Jewish homeland, but that plan was scuttled. He sent out the St. Louis, a boat filled with Jewish refugees. And the St. Louis was turned down at all the world's ports, came to Cuba. Cubans said, no, we won't take the Jews in. The United States said, no, we won't take the Jews in. The St. Louis had to go back to Europe, where the Jews on that boat, a lot of them ended up dying in the death camps. In 1939, Hitler wanted to expel the Jews, not kill them. But there was nowhere for them to go, and at this critical juncture in history, Britain shut the gates of the Jewish homeland to any Jewish immigration, in effect locking 6 million Jews in Europe, where they died in Hitler's death camps. It's important this be put on the table. We are sensitive to Palestinian suffering, and we're going to get into the price paid by the Palestinians for some of these rejections. But let's not forget, if the Palestinians would have allowed that tiny little Jewish state, a third the size of the state of New Jersey, there would have been somewhere for these 6 million Jews to go. They did not perpetrate the Holocaust, but they, together with Britain, enabled the Holocaust because they locked these Jews in Europe at a time when Hitler decided he had to get rid of them. Murder in his sick mind became the only option. Offer number 2, 1948. After World War II, Britain says enough. We can't solve this conflict between Jews and Arabs in their land. We're going to hand it off to the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, and have them settle it. The United Nations deliberates, debates, comes up with the same solution that the Peel Commission did. You have 2 people claiming the same strip of land, divide it. That's the only way you can solve the problem. It's hard to see on this map, but what the United Nations offered the Jews was a little better than what the Peel Commission offered them. The different shade of green on that map is what was offered to the Jews, and the major shade of green that's on the rest of the map in the center there, that's what was offered to the Palestinians. It was all more or less a 50-50 split. The Jews, in addition to that tiny coastal strip, were offered land in the Galilee and all of the Negev desert. So, you have 50, maybe 60% of something the size of the state of New Jersey, over half of which is desert, offered to the Jews as their Jewish homeland. The rest is offered to the Palestinians. Not only do the Jews say yes to this offer, they dance in the streets with joy that finally, after 2,000 years, they'll have a right to return to their ancient homeland and have an independent Jewish commonwealth for the first time in 2 millennia. The Arabs say no. Not only do they say no, but they take up arms to destroy this tiny Jewish state in its crib. Not only do the Palestinians in the offered Palestinian state attack the Jewish areas, but eventually 5 surrounding Arab armies attack the tiny Jewish state. And their threat is to drive the Jews into the sea. They will not recognize any Jewish rights in the land. They will not permit a Jewish state in the land, no matter how big or how small. They are determined to drive the Jews into the sea and destroy the nascent state of Israel. Let's look at the price paid because of this second Arab rejection. Number 1 for the Jews. And don't forget, a lot of these Jews who are coming to Israel out of displaced persons camps, they have survived the Holocaust. They've finally been allowed to return to the Jewish homeland. Many of them are getting off boats still wearing their concentration camp uniforms because they have no other clothes. They're given guns and sent to the front to fight the invading Arab armies. Because of this war, over 6,000 Jews, 1% of Israel's population at that time, die in Israel's independence war. An amazing price to be paid. But the price for the second Arab rejection was also paid by the Palestinians themselves. Keep this in mind. When the UN agreed to the partition plan, when Israel declared its independence in those lines that we saw earlier, there was not one Arab refugee. The Jewish cities and towns were on land that the Jews purchased legally, like any one of us would purchase land. The land had been purchased. The community had been built. Tel Aviv was built on what had been sand dunes. No one had ever lived there. There was not one Arab refugee at this juncture. Had the Palestinians had said, okay, we both have claims here, we both have rights here, we will split the land, there would never have been a single Palestinian refugee. But they invaded and tried to destroy the state of Israel. And war is hell. And so things happen in war. Number one, civilians get frightened when there are bombs going off and guns being fired near their towns and villages. A lot of Arabs fled. Number two, there are recorded historical radio announcements where Arab leaders got on the radio and said, brothers, Muslim brothers, flee your homes in these villages near the Jews. We're coming to drive the Jews into the sea. Once we have done so, you can come back and reclaim your homes as well as their homes. And finally, thirdly, Israeli historians have noted that in some cases Israelis committed atrocities. You know, Israelis are not superhuman. Just like American soldiers have at times done horrible things and committed atrocities, so have Israeli soldiers. And so when Israelis engaged in violence, some Palestinians fled as well. It was a result of all these three things. But it's an interesting thing to attack a Jewish state, seek to destroy the Jewish state, and then complain about the manner in which we did not permit you to destroy us. The fact is, this was a war not of choice. This was a war forced upon that tiny Jewish state. It's a miracle that state survived. In the process of this war, 600,000 Palestinians fled their homes, and it created the Arab refugee problem. All for number three, the Six-Day War. After Israel's War of Independence, after Israel survived that invasion, Israel grew. You see that different shade of green now includes all of the south, the Negev Desert, the coastal strip, and the northern Galilee. That part that looks like the backwards B, that's the West Bank. Jordan conquered that in the Independence War. And that little strip that says Gaza, Egypt conquered that. That became part of Egypt after the Independence War. This is how Israel looked after 1948. This is how Israel looked in 1967 when 5 Arab armies once again invaded Israel. Keep this in mind. The West Bank and Gaza are in Arab hands. If it's all about ending the occupation, why did the Arabs invade Israel in 1967? If it's all about ending the occupation of the West Bank, why did they refuse the state of Israel in 48? Israel wasn't offered the West Bank. If it's all about ending the occupation of the West Bank, why did they refuse the Peel Commission plan in 1937? Israel was not offered the West Bank. There seems to be a deeper trend here of rejecting a Jewish state in the Middle East, no matter how small, no matter where. This is how Israel looked on the eve of the Six-Day War. In fact, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was created in 1964 before Israel had the West Bank. Again, it can't all be about the occupation of the West Bank. Everything we're talking about now preceded that. So here is Israel on the eve of the Six-Day War. Long story short, Egypt commits acts of war against Israel, cuts off its straits to shipping, forces peacekeepers out of the Sinai. Israel preempts Egypt. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq attack Israel. Things go well for Israel. In 6 days, Israel conquers the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights in the north. Triples its territory in 6 days, in what many view as a modern miracle. Israelis really believed on the eve of that war they were going to lose their state and lose their lives. They were terrified. Within 6 days, they had conquered the West Bank, Gaza, Egypt, Golan in the north, and they had reunified and liberated East Jerusalem. Now, the so-called occupation of the West Bank and Gaza begins, won by Israel in the defensive war. What is Israel's first response? What is Israel's first response after taking over the West Bank, taking over the Gaza Strip, taking over East Jerusalem? They offer to give it back to the Arabs in exchange for peace. Their first reaction was, okay, you attacked us, we won, we conquered this land that is enormously important to our defense. Their first action was to say, we will give it back to you immediately, just recognize us, make peace with us, it will all be yours. There never would have been an occupation lasting more than a month or two had that offer been accepted. But that offer was not accepted. The Arab League met the next month in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. The Arab League, all the Arab countries met in Khartoum, and what was their response to this Israeli offer of peace? The famous, infamous 3 no's. They issued an official statement saying no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. That was their response. That is why Israel began what has become, unfortunately, a long occupation of the West Bank. The Arabs wouldn't take it back, and Israel was not inclined to hand over strategically vital territory to people still at war with her. Israel kept its troops there waiting for the day when the 3 no's would turn into yeses. Offer number 4, again, keep in mind, Israel said, we're going to hold on to this territory until the 3 no's turn into yeses. Until someone will promise us they'll take this land but not use it to attack us, but actually live with us in peace. For all intents and purposes, the occupation ended in the 1990s. Israel removed most of its troops and let the Palestinians rule themselves in the West Bank. That's in blue what Israel offered the Palestinians in Camp David. And by the way, I'm not relying on the Israeli side. I'm relying on President Clinton and Dennis Ross, his chief negotiator. That's what Israel offered the Palestinians. If you look at that, what you see is all of Gaza, almost all of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Barak had offered the Palestinians control over Arab East Jerusalem. And there's a couple of minor strips there where you see that were not offered to be returned, where the dotted line is not met by the blue. In exchange for that land in the West Bank Israel wanted to retain, Barak offered compensation, land from Israel proper of equal space. So for every inch that was not going to be given back of the West Bank, an inch from Israel would be given to the Palestinians. So in effect, Barak offered the Palestinians at Camp David all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, all of East Jerusalem, an end to the occupation, an independent Palestinian state. And what was the response from Arafat? No. He said no. And not only did he say no, he didn't come back with a counteroffer. He didn't say, no, I don't want that switch. I want the land in the West Bank. I don't want parts of Israel. No, he didn't come back with a counteroffer. What he came back with, and subsequent proof has emerged, what he came back with was the Intifada. What he came back with was a wave of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians where he competed with Hamas, his terrorist group competed with Hamas's terrorist group to see who could blow up more Jews and therefore prove themselves to be the champions of the Palestinian cause. And I don't know if you folks remember this, but there was a time, right in this time zone, 1999, 2000, where every week you were turning on the news and hearing about another restaurant in Israel blown up, another cafe in Israel blown up, another bus in Israel blown up. Now, I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to study at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I spent a semester there. Shari spent a semester there. Hopefully some of you will get a chance. One of these guys went into the cafeteria at Hebrew University where I used to eat lunch every day and blew himself up and killed, I think, 12 students, half of whom were Americans studying abroad. This was going on day after day, week after week. So the price paid by rejection number 4, again, offer number 4 by Barak to Arafat at Camp David. Rejection number 4, Arafat says no counteroffer, instead starts the Intifada. The price paid by the Jews was the Intifada, over 1,000 Israelis killed in terrorist bombings. The price paid by the Palestinians for rejection number 4 was also high. You remember Israel had vacated all of the West Bank? Well, there's a problem. Counterterrorism depends on boots on the ground. You can't stop people from crossing the border into Israel and blowing up buses and cafes unless you know that they're plotting an attack, unless you know that something's in the works so you can intervene and stop them before they travel the mile or two into Israel. You need intelligence, you need boots on the ground, and since Yasser Arafat was not only refusing to stop terrorism, but was actually spending money on and encouraging terrorism, Israel had no choice but to go back into the West Bank and reoccupy it so they could stop this wave of terrorism. I would argue any responsible government would do exactly the same thing. I would argue any responsible government has an obligation to do exactly the same thing. So because of Palestinian rejection number 4, Israel returns its troops to the West Bank. The occupation, the terrible occupation you're going to hear so much about on campus, was resumed. It could have ended had the Palestinians only said yes. Offer number 5. 8 years have passed. He decides, let's try it again. Yasser Arafat's dead. Mahmoud Abbas is the new Palestinian leader. He seems less bloodthirsty than Arafat. He seems less committed to terrorism than Arafat. Maybe, finally, someone will say yes to peace. Ehud Olmert offers Mahmoud Abbas the following: everything in green. So basically, he's offering him all of Gaza and all of the West Bank except for the little blue spots. You see those blue spots? Israel wanted to retain those blue spots because that's where Jewish communities are living. But in exchange for the blue, Israel is going to offer the red at the bottom of that inverted B and next to Gaza. Inch for inch, what was not returned from the West Bank, Olmert offered to return from Israel. So in effect, Ehud Olmert offered to Abbas what Barak offered, but only a little bit better. More West Bank land, less compensation land from Israel. So in effect, what was offered in 2008 to Abbas was all of Gaza, all of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and compensation for any land that was not directly given back in the West Bank. Abbas just says no. He just says no. He's not willing to say yes. He turns it down, and no one really understands exactly why. Because this is apparently what the Palestinians want. They want an end to the occupation. They want an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza. What was wrong with this offer? At least counter-offer. He didn't. Turned it down. To review the bidding then, a Palestinian state has been offered and rejected in 1937, the Peel Commission, 1948, United Nations, 1967, after the Six-Day War, 2000 by Ehud Barak, 2008 by Ehud Olmert. Each time it was turned down. The reason why there are Palestinian refugees is because of that second rejection in 1948, which led to a war in which the overwhelming number of Arab refugees fled out of fear from war. Would never have been one single Arab refugee had offer number 2 been accepted, or had offer number 1 been accepted. Secondly, the occupation continues. The occupation came into being because of that third refusal, 1967. Israel wanted to give it back. Israel finally possessed it, wanted to give it back. It was refused. The occupation was reasserted after the refusal in 2000. Israel had to stop terrorism. The occupation continues because of the refusal in 2008. Israel would have withdrawn. The offer was rejected. You know, I personally, and a lot of Israelis, were very excited by what Ehud Barak did in 2000. We said, you know what? It's the only way there will be peace. We can understand why Palestinians would want what Jews want, why they'd want independence and a homeland of their own. They were very excited. And we believed Arafat. I have to admit it, I believed Arafat. I thought, okay, man finally came to his senses. Blood and killing isn't going to get his people a homeland, but negotiations are. Any rational mind would have accepted that. A lot of us were disillusioned after 2000. A lot of us who believed deeply in the two-state solution were disillusioned after 2000 because we couldn't explain the refusal. Our disillusionment was deepened in 2008 because we can't explain the refusal. And so I've reluctantly had to conclude, I didn't always believe, but I've reluctantly concluded that there is a deeper problem, and it is this Arab rejection of the Jewish claim. It is this Arab refusal to recognize a Jewish state anywhere in the land. That's what's driven the conflict from day one. That's what continues to drive the conflict today. So when people try to portray the Israelis as the obstacle to peace, I'm afraid that simply stands in the face of a lot of history and of a lot of failed efforts and of a lot of Jewish blood that's been spilled because of those failed efforts and of a lot of Palestinian suffering that's resulted because of those failed efforts. I'm someone who, look, I'm sorry, as a Jew, as someone whose people experienced what Irving discussed last night, the last thing on earth I would want to participate in or support would be the persecution of another people, the denial of the rights of another people. That is abhorrent to me, and it should be, because of what my own people suffered. And that's why I get upset about what's going on in Darfur. That's why I get upset when Christians are bombed in Arab cities. That's why I get upset about what happened in Bosnia. And it's why I get upset about the suffering of the Palestinians. But when you know the history, I conclude quite confidently that if the Palestinians are angry, and they should be, it should be at their grandparents and their parents for turning down these offers over and over again, choosing rejection and terror instead of acceptance and peace. I've become quite comfortable with Israel's behavior over the decades. Israel is imperfect. Israel is a human government like any other which makes mistakes. Israelis are human and sometimes give in to anger or fear. But ultimately, I look at this history and I believe Israel has behaved far better than any other human nation, has held itself to a much higher moral standard than any other human nation. I become very proud to be an advocate for Israel. I become very proud of the nation state of Israel. It makes me proud as a Jew to see the lengths to which Israel goes to avoid civilian casualties, which is something we can discuss tomorrow if questions exist. The length to which Israel goes to alleviate Palestinian suffering, and the willingness of Israelis to give up their biblical, historical, strategic heartland because they can recognize the rights of others to the strip of land they claim as their own. And I pray for the day when Palestinians can rise to that level and recognize the rights of others to the land that they feel they own. And when that day comes, perhaps Israel will finally know peace. Thank you guys very much.